One day, James arrived at Natford to take his passenger train. He had just backed down onto the coaches when the Fat Controller came to see him. "Hope you can give us a good ride this morning, James," he said. "I have an important meeting to go to, and I don't want to be late. Do your best, won't you?" "Of course, sir," replied James. "We'll have you there in no time." "Well done," laughed the Fat Controller. "I know I can rely on you." Then the guard's whistle blew. "Better get in, sir, otherwise you'll miss the train." The Fat Controller rushed onto the platform, boarded the train, and James set off. On every passenger train, there is something called an emergency call. If there is an emergency, it can be used to call the guard and it automatically stops the train at the same time. But it must only be used in an emergency, otherwise the person who pulled it may have to pay a fine. On James's train today, there was a party of foreign holidaymakers. They could not understand English very well and thought the chain above the door was calling for the buffet car attendant. So they pulled it suddenly. The brakes came on hard and James had to stop as quickly as he could. "Oh no," he groaned as he came to a standstill. "Now what?" "Emergency, James," said his driver, looking back. "Someone has pulled the cord." The guard walked along the train to find out what was wrong. The foreign visitors were pleased to see him, but the guard was not pleased when they asked for 4 cups of coffee. The matter was soon cleared up, and the guard told James he could go. But when he tried to start, he found that he couldn't. The sudden action of the brakes had locked them solid, and James couldn't move an inch. There's a problem. I can't move. Ugh, I'm stuck." James," said a voice. It was Caroline. "Caroline," said James, "what are you doing here?" "And what are you doing here too, James?" said Caroline back. James was curious, but then he realized where he was standing. The train had stopped right across a level crossing, and by now there were long queues of cars on both sides, waiting to get over the railway. James was overcome with embarrassment, but he couldn't do a thing about it. The Fat Controller came, and the motorists all told what a nuisance the railway was. "I'm sorry, sir," said James sadly. "Not your fault, James," he replied, "but I don't know how I'm going to reach my meeting." James didn't know either, but then he saw a flash of color in the traffic queue caught his eye. "Isn't that Bertie waiting?" said James. "Maybe he could help." Botheration! Thomas will never believe me in this. Now I'm stuck. What a nuisance railways are. James told his crew about Bertie, and in a flash, James's fireman was running down the road. A few minutes later, he came back grinning broadly. "No problem, sir," he said to the Fat Controller. "He's trying to reach the same place as you. He said he'll be happy to take you when he has turned around." The Fat Controller was pleased. A few minutes later, Bertie turned around and took the Fat Controller to the meeting. It was another hour before a fitter came to mend James's brakes, and longer still before James could get his train moving. At last James's brakes were fixed. He reversed backwards to let the gates open and let all the cars safely cross the railway. "At last," a lot of the drivers said. At last, James was able to continue on with his journey late but safely. The foreign visitors felt sorry for the delay and promised never to make the same mistake again. James felt certain that they wouldn't. When James returned to work the next day, some engines had already known James's traffic jam. Instead of saying anything, they just make beep beep boop boop voices. James couldn't understand how some of the engines managed to know his traffic jam, and decided to remain quiet for the rest of the day.